Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Fowler. I'm a partner in the real estate group at Mortar, and I'm very pleased to welcome everyone to our webinar, Reimagining Commercial Space, a Forced Evolution. With over 7 million cases nationally and over 200,000 deaths, the human toll of COVID-19 has been horrendous and terribly tragic. Together with the economic fallout, the impact on commercial real estate has been extreme. We have gathered here a group of panelists to talk about reimagining commercial space, and in particular, to look at the impact that COVID-19 has had on commercial real estate, to look at how they have seen landlords, tenants, developers, and other industry participants adapt to the new reality, as well as what they foresee as the future of commercial real estate. We will be focusing on retail, office, as well as industrial properties, that sector of the real estate industry. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. First is Robin Abrams. She is a vice chairman at Compass Real Estate. She has years of experience in representing both tenants and landlords, with particular skills in how to repurpose particular spaces. So she is an ideal panelist, and we're lucky to have her here. We also have with us Glenn Brill. He's a managing director with FTI Consulting, which is a global business advisory firm. Glenn specializes in real estate finance and transaction management. So with over 25 years of experience in all things real estate, we welcome Glenn. And finally, we have Jason Davis, who is a managing director with Turnbridge Equities, a privately held, vertically integrated real estate investment and development firm. Jason is responsible for sourcing and executing investments across all asset classes within real estate. And in particular, he'll be able to speak to the redevelopment and repurposing of a number of different projects well before COVID, and especially in reaction to COVID. So with that said, let's jump right into it. We would, first I'll call upon Glenn. You know, with this notion of talking about past, present, and future, so far, what do you see as the overall impact of COVID-19 on the real estate industry just generally?
Well, thank you, Mark, and I'm pleased to be here with Jason and Robin today. I would say this, that you know, trends are in place, and COVID is effectively an accelerant for those trends. When you look across retail, and if you look in office and industrial, you know, the things that have been driving change are in place. You know, the digital workplace, e-commerce, things of that nature, the desire for convenience, you know, certainly the trade deficit and the importation of goods. COVID is really just pushing that along at a much more rapid pace. What's occurred, which is to say a lot of people working from anywhere, for instance, in the office space is causing the use case is changing, and everyone is starting to think about, well, what is the office of the future, and is it going to be a place where, everybody shows up once in a while, or there's some folks who'll be here all the time, there's some folks who will never be here. So that's a pretty straightforward example of it. In the instant of, let's say, housing, demographic trends have been demonstrating that millennials who aren't as young as they used to be, the oldest millennial might be 37, depending on who you talk to. I mean, they've been heading out to the suburbs for a while. So the urban exodus was underway to some extent, and COVID accelerated it, whereby people are, they're acting on their desires a little sooner perhaps than they might. And in the industrial space, well, certainly the increase in e-commerce, and again, the ongoing trade deficit, which is getting larger, you need warehousing, and in particular, just-in-time warehousing, whereby e-commerce can really compete well with brick and mortar in its ability to provide the instant gratification of a purchase by delivering something to someone's home within hours of purchasing it. But, in a greater sense, and I think it affects office and I think it affects retail, the notion of convenience, especially in an urban lifestyle, you can't underestimate it at all. And COVID is creating a shift in behavior. A new set of conveniences are falling in place. And I think it's safe to say that the new normal, whatever that may be, once confidence is restored in public health and consumers and users of real estate return in greater numbers, it's going to be different. And people's habits have changed, and they're not necessarily just going to return to the old ways of doing things.
Okay. Glenn, thank you for that. Jason, you operate in a number of different markets throughout the country. What is your take on the impact of COVID in the areas, in the geographic markets in which you are developing and operating, and how have you viewed it and over the last 6 months?
Yep. Thanks, Mark. First of all, I think probably have a lot of New Yorkers in the audience, and I think one thing we've learned in history is to never bet against New York. But I think at the same time, some of the points Glenn brought up are good ones in that I think COVID, rather than being a fundamental reordering of things, it's more of an accelerant, right? So we've been at Turnbridge believers in lower cost knowledge markets. So markets such as Austin, Raleigh, Durham, Nashville, Denver, to name a few. And I think that we're going to see an acceleration of the trends that have favored those markets now, really for the better part of the last cycle, in terms of net in-migration, lower cost of living, highly educated workforces, arguably better quality of life. And I think, COVID now, if you've got fewer restraints on needing to be in the office every day and remote work gets, harnessed by more companies decide to go more to a hub and spoke model of officing, I think you're going to see a further acceleration of these high growth, especially knowledge markets through the Sun Belt and lower cost of living areas than, just say the gateway markets.
Thank you, Jason. And Robin, with a strong focus on retail in New York City and the New York metropolitan area, you've been in the front lines seeing the impact of the lockdown and the gradual reopening, as well as the impact on some of the more violent protests that had caused so many stores to board up during the late spring and early summer. So what have you seen on the ground in terms of the retail tenants and the landlords that you've represented over the past 6 months?
I agree with everything that's been said so far. Retail in particular was already challenging pre-COVID. COVID exacerbated it, and then the protests with a lot of the rioting and trashing of stores, further created difficulty for retailers. So, unfortunately, there were many that didn't come back, but there were already a fair amount of closures. And I think part of it obviously was the changing nature of retail. We saw fashion tenants starting to pull out, opening smaller stores, opening fewer stores. And so there was already a significant amount of vacancy, which was leading to a softening market. What that was doing on the positive side is it was encouraging a lot of new categories of users that couldn't afford retail space and was traditionally taking space that was upstairs in buildings. It was more destination on a side street. And so a lot of these users that were more service oriented, who are going to continue to need space, to a large extent. We have telemedicine, but I think the people are still gonna, by and large, go to the urgent care, the medical clinics. We're seeing dental, we're seeing on the health, wellness, and fitness. It's a huge category with a large group of tenants who are now absorbing some of this space because, again, so much is available and the rents have come down and are now affordable for them. So, CBD users, compounding pharmacies, these urgent care and concierge medicals have now extended again to include dental, to include acupuncture, chirotechnology. Small door veterinarian is opening, similar concept. The City MD guys are involved in that. So these categories are fortunately absorbing some of these vacant spaces. There are existing tenants, fashion tenants, that had stores in market areas that knew what their sales volumes were and that are now taking advantage of a down market to lock in long term. There are e-commerce and other brands taking advantage of the ability to do very flexible and creative deals with short-term lease obligations or license agreements, some of them in fact with percentage only rent and no base rent or minimal base rent and percentage rent. So in some ways, we're starting to see the market come back because it's now very opportunistic, and for tenants that can be forward thinking, it's actually a good time to be locking in deals.
You see, Robin, the bid-ask gap starting to narrow with, I would call pre-COVID, we see, on Madison Avenue and 3rd Avenue and in other major shopping districts in New York City, for instance, a lot of vacancies, landlords may be holding out for higher rent, tenants holding out for better bargains. Are you starting to see more realism where landlords finally said, okay, we got the memo, we need to start lowering, our asking rents, and tenants saying, especially some of the examples you've given us, it's time to step up now is the best time, we'll probably see in a while?
Listen, again, the market was already softening. I think that there were landlords that were reluctant to reprice their space, but it's all supply and demand. And if there's no competition for space or your space is priced above the other, you're not going to get a tenant. So I do see, some landlords that have not changed their pricing. And I think their thought is that tenants are going to look to negotiate. Everybody is looking for bargains, and that regardless of whether they lower their asking rent with COVID or not, they're going to get offers that are still going to be at less than what is being asked. And so, we update our maps, we walk the street, we call everybody. We are literally every couple of weeks having to do this. And I had, another broker call me yesterday and say, you're all over Madison, what's going on? I called him back 3 times. I said, you know what, you were right. That rent was here, we've checked, it's now here. So with regard to every piece of space that one might look at in an area, if you're looking to secure a piece of space, you need to understand what the asking rent is, whether it's pre-COVID or post-COVID, and then you have to compare it to what else is on the market like you always did to understand what the value should be. So there, you know, it's for better or worse, there are absolutely no standards, especially now it's the Wild West, and every landlord kind of creates their own rules and regulations. So it makes it a little bit more challenging, but I do think, again, that there's more cooperation. You know, we're seeing the kinds of deals that Jason is probably used to doing in the city. You know, if you said TI, tenant allowance, cash contribution, landlords didn't know what that meant. And they certainly were not giving those kinds of incentives. And now lots of incentives are being offered. Tenants, again, are doing lower base rent with percentage rent. Tenants potentially have the ability to cancel the lease, much like they did in malls. You know, they had a kick out. So we're doing longer terms with the ability to cancel if the sales aren't good. We're giving, you know, landlords are giving free rent periods for the build out with additional rent at some discounted level, with perhaps some contribution in terms of work. And we're also addressing COVID. You know, every tenant that puts in an offer puts in some kind of language asking for some protection with regard to a potential shutdown due to COVID or due to, you know, another circumstance that may preclude them from operating.
Robin, can I ask you, are you seeing landlords giving those COVID clauses? Because we've started getting them as well. And our feeling is that it just makes a deal much harder to underwrite, both at exit and from a financing perspective, because there's this overhang that, you know, revenue could just dry up and it's totally exogenous.
So the deals that we've done to date, you know, again, I think it's all about creativity and compromise, even more so today. Mm-hmm. So we have not had a lot of landlords say, number one, we'll agree to any circumstance at any time. We have had landlords say, we will agree to a second wave due to this COVID that is occurring now, because if we don't do that, we can't get tenants off the fence and they want to wait and position deals for next year. And we want them to commit now and we want them to take possession now. So by and large, what we've gotten both sides to agree to is a 50% rent abatement if there's a shutdown due to a second wave. So they have some obligation to pay. Maybe they're operating at, you know, limited capacity. They're still doing e-commerce sales, whatever. So we've said, you know what, we're going to cut the pain, but you still have to be obligated and engaged, and the tenant will take a hit and the landlord will take a hit.
So Jason, just getting back to you, I know that you have done a tremendous amount of repositioning of assets, and you've also, Turnbridge has invested in warehouse logistics space near city centers. Maybe you could tell us a bit about your experience there, because it's relevant to how we are shifting as a society to greater online shopping, which I would imagine puts greater pressure on those who are fulfilling that demand to acquire more logistics space to service that. So maybe you can give us a little bit of background on what you've been doing in that area and how it's been affected by COVID.
Sure. Yeah, we've been pretty active in the last mile space, starting in and around the New York metro area for about the last 4 years, and that continues to pick up, and our footprint's now expanded across the East Coast, again in and around major urban areas and ports primarily. But in what we've seen over the last, really over the first 3 months of COVID, and I guess now we're in month 7 of it, but the first 3 months we saw e-commerce almost double, from about 15% of total retail sales to north of 25% of total retail sales. And that was about an expected 5 years of growth that happened over 3 months. So it was pretty astronomical. It happened all at once. And so we're seeing, I mean, it was already a bit of a land grab among the major retailers, both looking to more efficiently service their stores, but then also figuring out how do they most efficiently push product out to customers. you know, by and large, a lot of them operate on the same model, which is that they're using various third-party logistics firms to deliver. The real outlier is Amazon, who effectively in the last 2 years has built up a logistics operation that you know can basically is at par with Federal Express or UPS in terms of its breadth and its depth. And so the amount of space Amazon alone has taken up has been astronomical, with multiple delivery stations within metro, you know, individual metro areas. They'll have delivery stations every couple of miles because we've seen all the prime trucks now that drive around, the little Sprinter vans that drive around doing deliveries. They've internalized all of it. Most other retailers are still relying on UPS, FedEx, and USPS, and so the distribution model is a little bit different. But you know, as more sales have moved to e-commerce, Prologis has done research. I'm sure some of it's self-serving, but they estimate that every dollar of sales that moves from brick and mortar into e-commerce requires 3 times as much warehouse space as is required for bricks and mortar sales. And
why is that?
Well, you see how some of it works. You know, for example, if you just take Amazon, for example, they've got their big 1 million+ square foot fulfillment centers. Those fulfillment centers, basically where they warehouse product, they put them into a box. They then ship them to a second facility where they label the box, they sort it depending on where it's going, and then it'll go to a third facility, which is actually going to be where those Sprinter vans line up, and then pull everything out to your house. So that package that takes, you know, 1 day to get to you from Amazon has probably been through 3 Amazon warehouses within that 24-hour period. And so you get a sense for how much space they need, you know, plus they've, you know, in addition, you know, if you're a retailer, bricks and mortar retailer, you are getting shipments either by the large box or by the pallet. If you're Amazon, you're breaking down that pallet and you're shipping individual items of everything. So the amount of work that's going on inside of your warehouse is really astronomical, and it's remarkable to see.
So Jason, is every warehouse facility, you know, when you look at to invest, develop warehouse facilities, let's take New York City as an example, last mile, whether it's South Bronx, Long Island City, New Jersey, whatever. What characteristics do you look for, and how have you seen the market impact the availability and pricing?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are different categories of warehouses depending on where you are. So, you know, the more outlying areas are where you're going to see the big 500,000 to 1 million square foot, you know, really regional warehouses. They're 40 feet clear because they're stacking and storing product. As you get more infill, ceiling heights become less of a concern because it's really more about velocity. It's about how quickly can you move product through that warehouse, because you go into the Lehigh Valley and Amazon's paying $4 a foot for a 1 million square foot warehouse. You come into the South Bronx, they're paying $30+ a foot for that same warehouse space. So it's all about how much product you can move through. And what we've seen become even more important is the amount of parking and the amount of outdoor space, because especially for a user like Amazon, if you've got 110 Sprinter vans that are servicing a single distribution facility, you need a place to put them. And not only do you need a place to put the 110 Sprinter vans, you need the place to put the 110 drivers who show up in their own cars before they take the Sprinter vans, and the 100 people that work in the warehouse that are there even before those people get there. So we're seeing parking requirements become as important as the warehouse space. And, you know, Amazon, for example, and they really are an outlier, they'll pay almost the same $30 a foot they will for indoor space for parking, because it's that important to them. And again, they've built a logistics business as much as an e-commerce enterprise.
Thank you. Glenn, you know, we've been reading a lot about you know, office space, and you know, some recent polls have showed us. I think there was a Gensler study that was produced that 82% of respondents said that they want to go back to the office, even though 12% in the New York City market seem to be working from home quite nicely, but yet, you know, 90% of employers expect to see some amount of continued work in the future from home. you're, you know, in your consulting work, you know, you represent a lot of different clients. What are you seeing on the ground now in terms of how, whether major office tenants are preparing for the future, or how office owners are positioning themselves?
Well, I'd say it's a real-time situation, and effectively, office users are trying to figure it out right now. Historically, about 8% of the office workforce works remotely. They work from anywhere. WFA. There are some surveys out there, Harvard Business School, other folks who think that that number could go up to between 15 and 20%. In part because there are a lot of folks who really like to cut down on their commute. They like to cut down on the expense of commuting. They like working from home. They have the space. They have the peace and quiet to do it. There's another group of folks who definitely want to be back in the office, and then there's another group that would probably be there 2 or 3 days a week. And there can be no doubt that the office is an ecosystem unto itself. It has to be some sort of hygienic environment today. Open plan where people, you know, typical historically office requirement is about 200 square feet per human being. If you go to a co-working space, it's about 95 square feet per human being. I'd say those days are going to be tough. I mean, I don't think employees will feel comfortable doing that. So social distancing at work, for sure, you're going to have to do it. The touchless office, sure, if you can figure that out, and that's doable. Better HVAC, filtering, all of those things, indoor air quality, it all will be a concern. But ultimately, corporations, office users, you know, they see an opportunity whereby, you know, real estate is the second largest cost they have after talent. And, you know, granted the durations on leases, you know, they can be quite extensive and they're kind of locked in to some extent, but if they see the opportunity, they're going to give it some serious consideration with respect to shrinking their footprint. And generally, one of the big rubs between office leases and users is the duration, whereby, you know, corporations have to sign 10-year leases. They don't have 10-year business plans. And if they could sign shorter leases, they certainly would. And the notion of outsourcing office space, which is essentially what co-working space is to some extent, as they focus on corporate users, those types of environments may become more appealing because you are getting a fully baked solution. You have the ability to expense it all. There's no amortization on your CapEx. So you got better accounting treatment and you got shorter durations. You can get in, get out. And not only is the burden of building the space and everything that goes along with it, with the planning, you also are relieved of the burden of operating it, whereby the outsourced providers can give you, you know, most of you know, receptionists, security, housekeeping, you know, all that fun stuff. So I think that solution is going to start to look a little better and better as office users start to figure out what is the real case here, the use case with respect to their employees and workplace strategies. And again, you know, the opportunity to outsource the workforce to some extent and to have remote workers, people working from anywhere, you know, you can broaden the labor pool. You don't have to recruit locally. You can recruit from all over the world. And there's some notion that perhaps wages, salaries will no longer have to reflect the local market, and they can reflect the broader labor pool for that particular skill set. And that could be a good thing. So employers, office users, they're looking at all those things. And, you know, I think very much it is a occupancy cost management exercise to some extent. They do not want to sacrifice productivity. Many businesses are getting good productivity from remote working. And there's been a number of studies on remote working, and you know, it has psychological effects on employees, good and bad. But certainly, you know, the very simple case is, you know, somebody who sits in an office, sits at a workstation all day in an office environment and doesn't talk to anybody all day, you might wonder, why are they there? You know, whereas the folks that do interact a lot, project teams, people doing things in real time. Certainly a trading operation is the classic example of people who are constantly communicating using nonverbal communication and things like that. You know, that makes a lot of sense. And I think finance is one of the industries that very much wants to come back. But then you've got other industries, other users, customer service, for instance, things of that nature, you know, which are big space users, you know, call centers, things of that nature. They're able to outsource that work pretty easily. And with some measure. So I think depending on the job, the level of interaction on site, there's a lot of decisions to be made going forward. And I think you are going to see some disruption in the office market. That's not to say, again, it will be offset to some degree by the need for more space to accommodate social distancing. And ultimately, the office market's going to be driven by economic growth. You know, that's got everything to do with it. And there is, you know, a recession out there. And, you know, that's going to take a toll on small business, on retailers, on office users. You know, that has to resolve itself. That has to work itself out too, to some extent. I think a lot of businesses are really, they are heading for the shelters. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, I hear you, Glenn. Thank you. And Jason, so I hear in the office market, like, you know, at least two different tensions. There could be, because of uncertainty, as Glenn said, in business modeling, people don't know how to forecast maybe beyond 5 years. On the other hand, there's a golden opportunity to perhaps lock in at lower rents, historically low rents. I hear a tension, you know, between, you know, demand for more space because, you know, the days of open plans and cramming a lot of people into small spaces is perhaps bygone because of fears of contracting the virus, whether it's the current COVID-19 or something in the future, versus less need for space because there are a bunch of people who can work really well remotely, and others we hear, you know, they need that spontaneous collaboration of running into each other literally in the office. So where do you think it nets out? Like, you know, where are the winners and losers?
I mean, it's a tough question, right? It is truly the $64 million question. I think some of it is also, you know, we all hope that this isn't going to last forever, right? And that, you know, we'll hopefully have a vaccine and come into, you know, at some point in 2021, feel like we can start to file COVID behind us. I'd like to believe that, you know, people are inherently social. People inherently, you know, I think that Gensler study that you cited, I think it was the Gensler study, had mentioned what people miss most about the office. And it was socialization as much as anything else. There's only so much time that you want to work like in your kid's bedroom before you're ready to go back to an adult's office. And so I think, you know, but at the same time, until people feel safe to do so, there's going to be a reluctance for people to come into the office. But I think once people start to feel safe, they're going to want to come in. I think there's always going to be in the back of people's minds this sense that we probably weren't thinking so much of before, which is, you know, the air that I'm breathing in is the air you just breathed out. And so I think you're going to see, as has been the case for, you know, most of this last cycle, that new buildings will probably continue to benefit from the fact that they're going to have the latest in HVAC systems, you know, whether they're various green or wellness certifications, I think are going to be important. Everything we're looking at now is about how do we program an outdoor space, whether it's individualized for every tenant, whether in a multifamily building it's per unit, or whether there's some type of communal open space that has, you know, very kind of specific areas where people can have a little bit of personal space. I think all that stuff's going to be important. It will probably continue to favor new buildings over, you know, kind of Class B commodity buildings. And I think we'll also, you know, continue to favor some of the higher growth markets that have, you know, climates that you can be outside 10 months plus a year.
Thank you, Jason. And Robin, I want to turn to you. You know, we see how fluid the situation is and how boundaries among retail, office, and industrial have become blurred. So my question for you is, especially with COVID, but maybe even started before, we started to see the emergence of new types of space usages that we hadn't seen before. Like, for instance, the proverbial ghost kitchens, where, you know, restaurants and others are having food prepared in commissaries that are not in higher rent areas, but maybe a little bit off the beaten track. You know, we see how retail tenants have been hurt by the lack of office, space occupancy by their traditional office workers, and what that has meant for the lunchtime and happy hour crowd. So what are you seeing, and how are you helping your clients deal with this?
So things in New York have always been fluid, and they're up and they're down and they're good and they're bad. And, you know, no doubt that it's challenging for many retailers, but I think, again, it creates opportunity for other users. So, you know, we have ground floor space in Tribeca that's a retail space, and we're now looking for office users for that space. I talked to a retailer today, an apparel tenant that had a location in Soho, and they said, we want something totally different. It can be destination. It's going to be a combination, you know, going back to what Jason said about needing all of this additional space for warehousing and distribution and whatever. They want a small retail presence, small showroom presence, but then they want space for warehousing, and it can be on a ground floor, but it can also be in a basement, you know. So we're getting all of these, as you say, blurring of the lines with users that are looking to do things that are not necessarily what had been the norm. And in part, it's because the way we're working is changing, as we've all said. Their businesses are changing. Their focus on e-commerce versus brick and mortar and how they accommodate those needs with regard to distribution are changing. And their audience is also changing, because we see people moving all over the city, in, out. We don't know what that's going to mean. Are we going to get a younger population coming in to fill a lot of the vacancy if some of these, you know, families have moved to the suburbs? Is that going to lead to uses that are, you know, more food and beverage, and hopefully when hospitality is back and open, filling some of these spaces now that rents are lower? So again, it's interesting, and I think circumstance creates a variety of opportunity, and the rules have become much more fluid and flexible in terms of who occupies what kind of space. You know, this week we had a couple of inquiries for office space, and the people that wanted the office space wanted to be closer to their homes. So we're having people tell us that they want to work closer to home so they can walk to work. We have that retail use. One of their requirements was outdoor space. They want a yard or an outdoor area to sit with their employees, to have a coffee, whatever. So, you know, there are new things that are becoming prevalent ideas and or, you know, motivating factors for what one's requirements may now incorporate that people didn't think of before.
That's very helpful, Robin. So what I'd like to do is, you know, we have only about 6 minutes left. And what I'd like to do is give each of you a couple of minutes just to tell us what you think the future holds for commercial space, office, retail, industrial, both before and after the development of a hopefully successful and effective vaccine. Glenn, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, again, I think the trends that are in place are going to continue. I think, to Robin's point, the utility of a store is going to be designed to fit into omni-channel retail. And the good news for landlords is that retailers have better margins in brick and mortar than they do online generally. So the brick and mortar store is not going away. Retailers like it. The question is, how does it fit into an overall strategy, and how do they benefit from having that presence and the ability to maximize sales in a particular location? They're no longer they're not going to suffer underperforming stores like they used to. So that's the good news there. I think on the office side, I think to Jason's point, 21st century office buildings, they should do pretty well because they're going to have the technology that is going to be suitable for the new office as that's developed over time. Obsolete buildings, older buildings, they're going to have a much tougher time. And I think you're going to see more, not just people working from home, but I think you'll see more businesses from home. And I would say in the residential space, I think live workspace is going to definitely be a nice space to be in. I think you're going to see folks who they live and they have their 7-8 person company in the back, so to speak. And I think that's a trend that you'll definitely see going forward. Industrial, I think, is really the no-brainer. I mean, I think, as you see growth in e-commerce, it's going to get better and better and better. I mean, I think, there's no doubt that, consumer goods are going to continue to be imported on a large-scale basis, no doubt. And, a lot of folks who have, they've expanded their participation in e-commerce, and that's probably not going to go away. I think a retail experience is going to have to be something that really is an experience, and it's going to have to be closely aligned with digital marketing. And again,
I hate to cut you off. I just want to.
We're running out of time.
Sorry, Jason. Your final thoughts in terms of the future, and is there any silver lining in any of this? It was a question from one of our attendees.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I definitely agree with what Robin and Glenn have said in terms of looking to the future and, the strength of omnichannel and changes to the way people are working. And, I think that will all continue, the acceleration of trends. I mean, I think as a silver lining, as investors, our view is that, there's always opportunity in destruction. And so it's about trying to, figure out where that is. And, we're in the process, for example, of emptying out and demolishing a regional mall that was, probably one of 6 in a metro area that isn't going to be needed. And so that's an opportunity right there where you've got, real estate that's incredibly well located, and, a trend that was going to be a reduction in the stock of malls nationally that's going to be really accelerated now. And so taking advantage of trends like that and, continuing to focus on e-commerce as well.
Thank you, Jason. And Robin, final words, in the timeless phrase, I think memorialized by Frank Sinatra, if you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. Is there hope for New York? What do you think, being a native New Yorker and in the trenches every day in New York City?
Listen, New York is resilient. I think it's already coming back. We see people on the street. I think after Labor Day, there were a lot of people that returned to the city that had been out of the city for some time. People want to be active. If you're in New York, you're there because you like the energy and you like the lifestyle. You want to go out to restaurants, you want to have experiences, and you want to interact with people. So I think for sure New York is coming back. There's actually, I was on a revenue call today, and there is a campaign that I think EDC is doing, talking about New York and saying exactly that. We're back, get your show on the road. This is where it's at. And, people are going to start, restaurants are starting to slowly open. Kids are going back to school. I do think that some of the stores are seeing some increased activity. I have a space on Madison. I was up at 85th Street. If you go, there's a Butterfield Market that just opened there. There are like 30 people on the street. They're sitting on benches. They're doing takeout coffee and yogurt, and the kids are there and the women are there. So I do think that a lot of what happened was pre-COVID, And, you know, going to Jason's point about the malls that were closing because we were overstored, you know, some of this is a natural needed correction. So when there's vacancy on Madison because rents were $2,000 a foot, that isn't necessarily just because retail was challenging. It's coupled with retail being challenging. But I think that our rents had gotten overly aggressive. There was almost too much confidence in what was happening with regard to retail in the market. And so now we're seeing retailers that are not strong, whose product is not good, going out of business. A lot of that, again, as Glenn said, was expedited by COVID, but some of that was going to happen and should have happened anyway. So we now have lower rent levels. We have all kinds of exciting users. And by the way, we have lots of inquiries from all kinds of experiential use, because yes, for retail to succeed, you have to give people a reason to want to go into these stores. And so there are all kinds of fabulous concepts that are out there looking at the market, understanding it's opportunistic, but waiting cautiously to lock in and take space and then open their business. So I think we'll be back bigger and better.
Terrific. So I want to thank everyone, all the attendees, and especially our panelists, Glenn, Jason, and Robin, for doing such a tremendous job during this panel. And I want to thank everyone at Green Swing Mortar for helping support this summit. Thank you, and please join us for our next panel coming up. Thank you again.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.